c4, English opening, opening line. The English opening move avoids a number of black defenses and proceeds on the more deliberate idea of counterattacking in the center, often in conjunction with fianchettoing both bishops. e5, English opening, opening line. The 1e5 variation treats the defense as if it were a Sicilian in reverse. g3, English opening, accelerated fianchetto variation, opening line. Consistent with the strategy of central light square control, but knight c3 first is more flexible. c6, out of opening book, knight f6 would have been in the English opening, accelerated fianchetto variation, opening line. d4, attacks black's pawn at e5. e4, moves it to safety. Knight c3, threatens black's pawn at e4. d5, protects black's pawn at e4 and attacks white's pawn at c4. Bishop g2. Knight f6. Bishop g5, pins black's knight at f6. Bishop b4, pins white's knight at c3 and makes way for a castle to the king's side. Bishop takes f6, pins black's pawn at g7 with a partial pin, forks black's pawn at g7 and black's queen and blocks black's pawn at f7. Queen takes f6. Frees black's pawn at g7 from the pin, and removes the threat on black's pawn at g7. Black wins a bishop for a knight. Material is even. e3. Knight d7. Knight e2. Makes way for a castle to the king's side. Knight b6. C takes d5, attacks black's pawn at e4. C takes d5, removes the threat on black's pawn at e4. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Queen b3, threatens black's bishop at b4 and clears the way for a queenside castle. Queen d6, protects black's bishop at b4. Castle kingside, frees white's knight at c3 from the pin. Bishop d7, clears the way for a queenside castle. a3, attacks black's bishop at b4. Bishop takes c3. Knight takes c3. White wins a bishop for a knight. Material is even. Castle kingside. Rook f c1. Rook f c8 partially pins white's knight. Bishop f1. Rook c7. Queen b4, attacks black's queen. Queen f8, moves it out of immediate jeopardy. Queen a5, pins black's knight. Queen d6, frees black's knight from the pin. Knight a2. h5. Rook c5. Rook c8. Rook a c1. h4. Rook takes c8, check. checks black's king. Bishop takes c8, protects black's king. Knight b4, takes the knight away from the edge of the board. H takes g3, isolates white's pawn at h2. H takes g3. White wins a rook and a pawn for a rook and a pawn. Material is even. Bishop e6. Queen c5, attacks black's queen. Queen f8, moves it out of harm's way. Knight a2. Rook c8, attacks white's queen. Queen a5, moves it to safety and attacks black's pawn at a7. Rook takes c1, pins white's bishop. Knight takes c1, frees white's bishop from the pin. White wins a rook for a rook. Material is even. Queen b8, removes the threat on black's pawn at a7. Knight a2. Knight d7. Knight c3, takes the knight away from the edge of the board. Knight f6. Queen c5. a6. Bishop e2. g6. a4. Knight d7, attacks white's queen. Queen e7, moves it to safety. Queen f8. Slightly better is Queen c7. Evaluating. The chess master recommends Queen to c7. You move your queen to c7. White replies by moving the bishop to d1. You move your queen to c4, which frees your knight from the pin. White replies by moving pawn to a5. You move your king to g7. White responds with the pawn to g4. You move your queen to c7, which threatens white's pawn at a5. White responds with bishop to b3. Your queen takes pawn, which frees your knight from the pin, and isolates white's pawn at b2. White counters with bishop takes pawn, which forks your pawn at e4 and your pawn at b7, and creates a passed pawn on d4. Your bishop captures bishop, which removes the threat on your pawn at b7 and your pawn at e4, and blocks white's pawn at d4. White answers with queen takes knight. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a bishop and a pawn for a knight and a pawn. Additionally, the mobility of your pieces is somewhat increased, and white's mobility is lessened. Also, white's pawn structure is a little weaker. Lastly, the pressure on your king is slightly decreased. Queen f8. Slightly better is Queen c7. Queen takes f8, check. Slightly better is Knight takes d5. Evaluating. The chessmaster recommends knight takes pawn at d5. Your knight takes pawn at d5, which protects your queen and creates a passed pawn on d4. Black responds with queen takes queen. Your knight captures queen, which checks black's king. Black responds with king to f8, which moves it out of check and attacks your knight. You move your knight to c8, which moves it to safety. Black replies by moving knight to f6, which threatens your knight. You move your knight to b6, which moves it to safety and blocks black's pawn at b7. Black responds by moving king to e7. You move your pawn to a5. Black responds with the king to d6. You move your pawn to f3. Black counters with pawn takes pawn, which attacks your bishop, creates a passed pawn on f3, and isolates your pawn at g3. Your bishop takes pawn at f3, which attacks black's pawn at b7. Black counters with the king to c7, which protects black's pawn at b7. You move your king to f2. Black counters with bishop to b3, which blocks your pawn at b2. You move your pawn to e4. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a queen and 2 pawns for a queen and a pawn. Additionally, black's pawn structure is weakened. Queen takes f8, check. Slightly better is knight takes d5. King takes f8. Black wins a queen for a queen. Material is even. King f1. The game ends in a draw.